Danka Noai Craig Ritchie, Guri Dangari Banata Guri Birpai. Baranga Manatanang Kulan Gutunda Baria, Balo Gakungaran, Nganiko Ninan Baria Ditinda, Ngungun, Barang Gundakan. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Craig Ritchie. I'm a Dungari man with connections to Biripi and to the Warramai people around Gloucester, Biripi around Taree. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we meet. And can I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and indeed to all Indigenous people that are gathered here tonight. Thank you for coming, and it's wonderful to see so many people here. Geez, I wondered why I feel tired. When I was a school teacher, which was my first career, my principal asked me how I was feeling, and I said, I'm tired. And he said, it took me a year to get tired, and I've been tired ever since, which wasn't the most encouraging piece of news for a young, enthusiastic school teacher at the time. I always get a bit shame listening to kind of recitations of some of that. I have to just, they've obviously sent you an old bio. Tragically, Margaret, I moved my PhD from Sydney to ANU, but you know, it's all friendly in the GO8, right? So, can I thank Professor Margaret Gardner, VC and President of Monash, for inviting me to deliver this fourth annual reconciliation lecture. We have a practice at IATSIS of sending out a weekly staff bulletin. There's a significant section of that is the Where's Craig bit. And I did chuckle, I must confess, when I read it earlier this week, and it announced that I was delivering a 45-hour Monash reconciliation lecture. I'm pleased to let you know that that's absolutely not true. It was absolutely a typo. It'll be 43 hours instead. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you some perspectives and some thoughts about reconciliation. Could I also acknowledge Professor Susan Elliott, thank you for your part in inviting me, Auntie Di Singh, Elder in Residence, Parbanata Carolyn Briggs, who I've known for some years now, largely through the Aurora project and the high school program. Every time we see one another, we threaten to mug one another in alleys for our spectacles. I think between she and I, we keep the optical industry in Australia well and truly going. I'd like to also acknowledge Professor Jacinta Elston, who is an old friend, or a friend of many years standing, perhaps that's a better way of putting it. We first met one another when we were working in Aboriginal health, and I think possibly on the Research Agenda Working Group for the NH&MRC, helping the NH&MRC focus their research funding in Indigenous health, and that quite possibly included being evacuated from a Surrey Hills hotel because of a fire alarm late one night. And you don't really know people until you've been evacuated from a hotel late at night. Particularly in Surrey Hills. So we've been friends for a long while. Well, this lecture, of course, has had a long list of esteemed people deliver it, including Senator Patrick Dodson, his brother Mick Dodson, who, of course, was chair of IATSIS for many, many years. I think when he retired, he'd been on the IATSIS Council for 27 years and chair for 17. He was the chair that appointed me to the role that I currently hold. And of course, most recently, I think, by Jill Gallagher, who I met when I was on the board of Nacho many, many years ago. And I thought, who the heck is this woman from Victoria? She was and it remains a force of nature. And it's wonderful to watch her lead the treaty work in this state as Treaty Advancement Commissioner. So I feel a little bit overawed, given that list of people. I will do my best tonight. Consistent with Carolyn's welcome, my aim or my purpose tonight is to do two things: to be thought-provoking about the question of reconciliation without necessarily being polemical, but thought-provoking, and secondly, hopefully, to be interesting. I can probably guarantee the first and hope for the second. So the central proposition of my remarks tonight, and the title of this address is From Accommodation to Transformation, Reconciliation and the Power of Indigenous Languages. So my central proposition in my remarks tonight is that reconciliation in Australia, if it is to realise its fundamental objective of improved relationships between Indigenous and settler Australia, requires a cognitive and a conceptual shift from pursuit of accommodation to the idea of transformation. And critically, Indigenous languages can play and will play a critical part in helping us do that. Now, to understand and to frame that sort of fundamental proposition, I think it's important that we think about the history of the idea of reconciliation, and it's quite frankly checkered history, particularly for many Indigenous Australians, myself included. So the first thing to understand is that the idea of reconciliation as kind of a meta-narrative in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs came about because, really I think under the leadership of the late great Bob Hawke in 1991. And he introduced this notion, or this notion became sort of the meta-narrative underpinning government policy because he had failed to deliver on his promise to Indigenous Australia of a national treaty. A policy position that he had flagged much earlier. Now, the reasons for the backflip, if you like, aren't actually important they're important, but not in the context of my remarks tonight. I live and work in Canberra, where mostly we are engaged in practicing the art of the possible. So I recognise that there are perhaps many pragmatic and good reasons why at that time the promise wasn't able to be delivered. But the fact is, the reconciliation process was offered, and I use that term a bit generously, in substitute for a treaty. In other words, the process as we know it was fundamentally a compromise. Now, for many Indigenous Australians, it is this fundamental compromise at the heart of the reconciliation process that remains problematic. It is often, perhaps mostly, a process in which the institutions, values and perspectives of the settler state are assumed, and a process through which a place within that particular set of arrangements, or I should say apparatus, I'm a bit Foucauldian, that a place within that particular set of arrangements in which we could be accommodated. It was a compromise framed around the fundamental impasse of non-Indigenous Australia's unwillingness to entertain a just settlement with Australia's First Nations and our unwillingness to do without that settlement. Reconciliation reflected the need to moderate these positions and find a way between them and accommodation. The second important thing that I want to mention tonight in relation to this idea of reconciliation from my perspective, at least as an Indigenous person, I'll leave others to adjudicate on their own, is the way in which the idea has very often been used to either counter or to control Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander aspiration. From my perspective, the burden of movement within the process of reconciliation has, for the most part, fallen on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We've been the ones who have been asked to understand just why it is that non-Indigenous Australia can't or won't compromise, and for us, on the basis of that understanding, to shift our position on things and to moderate our expectation. The central refrain of this moderation has been in the interests of reconciliation. And that's a pretty glum assessment, but I think a pretty real assessment. For example, never framed in these terms, but in the interests of reconciliation, we were asked to accept a reduction in the life expectancy gap would be a 50% reduction. So half of the gap would still continue to die young. But that was the most that could be delivered. A halving of the child mortality rate. So half our kids would still continue to die at an alarming rate. So as a consequence, progress towards reconciliation has been slow, and we face some continual challenges on the path to reconciliation. That said, there's been some real progress. My folks have written me a list of things. I'm not going to read them all, but I just allude to a couple. The changes to the Electoral Act in 1962 to give us the vote, the referendum that allowed us to be counted for the first time as part of the nation, and on the basis of that to influence the shape of the parliament in terms of how quotas were determined and all of those kind of things, and of course the power for the Commonwealth to make law in respect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I will say I have a great joy of working for an institution that this month is 55 years old. I like to say 55 because the institute will always be older than me. But the legislation establishing the institute was passed in 1964, in fact 3 years before the referendum that gave the power to make laws for the Commonwealth. We've covered off the fact that we weren't illegitimate for 3 years. Our legislation was made under the education powers of the Constitution because we're a research institute. The recognition of the flags, the Mabo decision that we've heard about tonight, that I think is variously oversold and sometimes undersold in terms of its impact, but critically important. People have walked across bridges, and of course in 2008 the apology to the stolen generations. There are a few examples that remind us that we have come some way, but that as we've already heard tonight, this is a journey that we're on. This is a process and we still have some way to go, but it's important that we recognise the generations of people that have fought hard for meaningful change. Pat Anderson, a great friend of mine, has been at pains to remind us at various times that Aboriginal Australia has nothing that was given to us on a silver platter. What we have is what we have fought for every step of the way, and it reflects our agency and our passions, and those passions and that agency ought to be reminded. We ought to remind ourselves of those, and they ought to be celebrated. In December 1992, the then Prime Minister made one of the most startling speeches that have ever been made in relation to Indigenous affairs. The cynic in me, because I do work and live in Canberra, the cynic in me says that was an easy speech to make when you were facing election that you had no chance of winning in March the following year, so pull out all the stops. Of course, then he did win that, the sweetest victory of all election, and sort of deja vu recently, isn't it? Made these comments, and I think this is a powerful comment from Paul Keating, and I'm quoting him directly now. As I say, the starting point might be to recognise that the problem starts with us non-Aboriginal Australians. It begins, I think, with that act of recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the disease, the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice and our failure to imagine these things being done to us. With some noble exceptions, we failed to meet the most basic human response and enter into the hearts and mind, enter into their hearts and minds. We failed to ask, how would I feel if this were done to me? As a consequence, we failed to see that what we were doing degraded all of us. So can I suggest to you that these words still sit a bit uncomfortably with our nation. They still niggle, they still confront. And the fact that these words continue to have this effect, for me, speaks to the need for us to reconfigure the idea and the process of reconciliation, as I have suggested, reconfiguring it around the idea of transformation rather than accommodation. Because for me, reconciliation that is about accommodation asks how we can find ways for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to fit into the arrangements that constitute the settler nation. Whereas reconciliation that is about transformation asks how can we transform those arrangements, if not in form and substance, at least in the way they work, particularly with indigeneity at the core rather than on the fringe. So where are we in that process? I don't need to give you folks in this room a history lesson. But I do think that there continues to be a discernible lack of appreciation by settler Australia at both a systemic and I think at a personal level about the grievances and the sense of historical injustice that Indigenous people feel. This must be addressed for Australia to be reconciled. This is the very heart of a process of truth-telling that the Uluru Statement from the Heart urges us to pursue. Bridging that division, that misunderstanding, that lack of understanding or appreciation is the greatest challenge, in my view, to the process of reconciliation. And part of that is engaging with some thoughts around the concept itself. And as I've tried to suggest, a lack of clarity and a lack of unified purpose has been embedded in the reconciliation journey throughout Australia's history. My view is, of course, that universities have a central role to play in this process of truth-telling. Not, I hasten to add, as bastions of orthodoxy. I'm deeply troubled by the notion that a university exists to inculcate a particular orthodoxy, let me use those language, rather than, as they should be, places that are home to the contests of ideas and shared learning and collegiate learning and thought leadership. So I ask myself the question then, why transformation? And the first answer that I want to give to that question is because the idea of transformation requires us to think about the system that we inhabit. There's an American sociologist, Edward Bonilla Silva, who agrees with me. No, I actually agree with him that there's about the futility of hunting racists. Any of you who are on Facebook understand the futility of doing that. It doesn't stop us. We keep doing it. I have a group of friends that all I seem to do is snooze, not them, but snooze the post that they forward on. There's something futile about that rather than focusing on how can we transform a system that gives room and creates those kind of people, really. And I want to touch on that in the context of reconciliation. I want to refer particularly, and I won't be too long about this because I could talk all night about this particular fellow. James C. Scott is a political scientist, a Yale political scientist, and in his seminal work, Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed, I think identifies four key things that undermine this idea of large state-based state initiatives and schemes designed to improve the human condition. In his analysis, he points to four things. The first of them is the state's imperative towards legibility, its need to make complexity simple. And particularly through the application of really simple, really thin, discursive kind of models that take complex situations and reduce it to manageable simplicity. So first of all that. Secondly, what he refers to as a high modernist ideology, which is a particularly evangelical Western rationality that is imposed on particular situations and contexts at the expense of local knowledge in particular and local ways of doing things. The third thing he talks about is the coercive power of the state. Now that sounds sinister, but every time the state makes a law, that is an exercise of coercive power. Every time, I'm no libertarian in most respects until somebody tells me what I shouldn't do, then I get a bit libertarian about things, or just difficult. But the coercive power of the state. And the fourth element, he talks about a weak, but I think it's not always a weak civil society, it's actually complicit civil society. And if you think about what I call in my research the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy enterprise, those four things are present, and I think they're present in the context of this reconciliation process. The state's desire to make it legible and understandable, the application of a particular way of thinking about things at the expense of local and more Indigenous ways of thinking about context and place in particular. It was the subject of a piece of legislation. It was an act that established the process of reconciliation in this country, and then the complicity of civil society. Importantly, in Scott's analytic, the chief effect of this is to squeeze out the voice and the perspectives of Indigenous people, particularly at local level. And that represents for me the chief weakness of large-scale state interventions. And I argue that those things are present not only in our policy enterprise, but in the case of Australia in the context of reconciliation. So why transformation? Because there's a system that needs to be changed. There's a second answer to that question, why transformation? And that's because there are some big issues emerging in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia and in what we have come to call Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, some big issues emerging, and business as usual will no longer suffice if it ever did. So let me just quickly refer to a few of those, not a great many of them, and I'm sure you'll recognise them. First of all, I think over the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps even longer, the thing that we're going to have to come to grips with, both as a nation and for those of us that work in public administration and service delivery, is the resurgence of Indigenous nationhood. We're no longer content to just be the Aboriginal community of Melbourne or the Aboriginal community in Canberra. There is an insistent and a resurgent Indigenous nationhood where yes, I'm an Indigenous man, yes, I'm an Aboriginal man, but I'm Dunghutti, along with my cousin Josh Smith up the back there. Dunghutti imperialism happening here in Victoria. But this growing Indigenous nationhood is going to confront and I think challenge and possibly upset and overturn the traditional ways in which the state and Indigenous Australians have interacted with one another. And so if we're not engaged in a process of system transformation and we're not involved in transformation at all, then we'll struggle to really come to grips with how it is that Indigenous people as First Nations might govern ourselves, might make decisions about our own business, and in fact might relate to the nation. That's a tricky task, and I don't think it's going to be an easy transition. Paradigm shifts are always really complex and really difficult, but there you have it. So that's an expression of my view, Craig Ritchie's. Don't take that as federal government policy, because that's not the kind of bureaucrat I am. The second thing is actually doing with Indigenous people. So turning that into something more than a two-word slogan. Just made sure it wasn't a three-word slogan, but it was the significant difference between former Prime Minister Turnbull and former Prime Minister Abbott is probably one word, two rather than three. There was actually lots more difference. I feel a bit bold about that these days since neither of them are in Parliament. But what is... put a timer on myself. What does it mean to work with? What does it mean to partner? What does it actually mean? And I'll take a pretty significant risk here. If you want to know what that looks like in terms of public administration, can I advise you, just quietly and just secretly, you might want to have a look at the Close the Gap speeches that were made in Parliament back in February. And yes, I certainly should encourage you to read the current Prime Minister's one, but you might want to pay attention to the then Leader of the Opposition's Close the Gap speech, which articulated, I think, one of the best definitions of what it means to work in partnership, genuine, real doing with. So that's the second, I think, if you like, mega trend that's coming along. The third one is the question of culture. My God, we do culture in a really difficult and unhelpful way in the public sector. And so for me, as a social scientist and someone who's deeply interested in the idea of culture as an operating system, culture as a way of life, culture as that framework that enables me to understand and engage with and operate in the world that is around me, of values, of ideas, we don't handle that very well at all. But for those of us in Indigenous communities, that's the thing that we mean when we talk about our culture and our heritage. It's not just about dot paintings and lap-laps, if I can be that blunt. No one wants to see this in a lap-lap, let me tell you. But the question of culture is a really important one because it runs right alongside our emerging nationhood, our emerging sense of ourselves. And of course, as you know very well in this state, the fourth thing that I want to quickly mention is the idea of treaty and settlement. We must come to grips with that. It will not go away. It will become more and more acute over the next 5 to 10 years. So if we're not engaged in a process of transformation, we won't be able to cope. We won't be able to do justice to that idea. So what I'm talking about is a big conceptual shift in the idea of reconciliation. Bill Stanner, in his Boyer lecture last century, well and truly last century, asked this question: so what is it Aboriginal people have always been looking for? And he went on to answer that question, and it's this, and I quote him again: a decent union of their lives with ours, but on terms that let them preserve their own identity, not their inclusion willy-nilly in our scheme of things and a fake identity. I think they're powerful words because they ring true today. That's what we want. But the development, he went on to say, development within a new way of life that has the imprint of their own ideas. He went on to critique the approach to Aboriginal affairs at that time. I won't dwell on that, but I read that in preparing this lecture and kind of went, wow, you know, that basically is the way we still do things. The particular thing that I wanted to highlight on that, he says, we are talking about non-Indigenous Australians, are asking them, Aboriginal people, to become new people. But this means in human terms that we are asking them to unbe what they are. We cannot have a process of reconciliation that is about asking us to unbe what we are. That's why transformation is important. Big changes. I'm reminded of a quote from that great 20th century philosophical opus, Steven Spielberg's Jaws. We're going to need a bigger boat. We're going to need a bigger conceptual and methodological boat. And I want to suggest to you, as I bring this to a close, that Indigenous languages are part of giving us a bigger boat. Languages, of course, as you know, are not just tools for communication. Words are not just the passage of air across our vocal cords, although physiologically I guess that's what they are. But languages are much deeper than that. They are a repository for each person's identity, our history, our traditions, our memory, their structures. They help us think. And I'm no linguist, so all of the linguists in the room, if there are any, you'll just have to grit your teeth and bear it. Alternative words create alternative structures. and alternative ways of thinking. And before colonisation, of course, there were 250 languages spoken on this continent, up to 600 dialects within those 250 languages. Now they're in a parlous state. We know that our languages are in a parlous state. I busted out the full panoply of my Dungari. I did it with some shame in front of my young relative up the back there. The tragedy is it took me to being 51 years of age to be able to engage with my language, and then only because I had the good luck to run an institute that employed the linguist that wrote our dictionary. Pure luck of the draw. My hope is that my children and my grandchildren will not have to wait till they're in their 50s before they get to engage with our language again. But our languages give us an alternative way to think about things, and this is why I think it's so important to reconciliation. I know I'm pressing the time limit, and Jacinta's going to throw something at me in a moment. There's a glass of water down there. Let me give you maybe 2 or 3 examples about how languages can help us move from the constraints and configurations imposed by monolingualism to something more nuanced, more sophisticated, that draws on a deeper history that's embedded in the very foundations of this country. We all know the idea of Makarrata and in its Yolngu origins. Now, we can have a debate about whether we should have a Makarrata or whether a treaty. The thing that I know is that Makarrata is much more than treaty in that sort of, juridical, legal kind of sense that it's often thought about. It's a philosophy. It's a deep philosophy that helped develop and maintain lasting peace among the Yolngu. So it's something different than just an agreement, something more powerful. That's what we want. The Gadigal have a word called putua, a word putua. There isn't a single English word for this one, but basically what it means is you warm your hands by the fire, stretching conceptually, you warm your hands by the fire while gently squeezing the fingers of the person sitting next to you. So it was a word that it wasn't just about you and the fire, it was you and the person sitting next to you and the fire. There's something powerfully evocative about the question of relationships and community and sociality that's embedded in that word, that if we can grasp that. We are promoting at IATSIS a thing called the Ngurra Project. Ngurra Project. So, Ngurra is an interesting word. It appears in many Aboriginal languages and it means the same thing. It's the word for camp. But there's an analysis, Yasmin Mushabash did an analysis of the use of the word Ngurra in the Walpuri language. And she says it radiates meaning on multiple levels that range from the idea of a simple camp and shelter through to more transcendent meaning associated with belonging and place and ancestral connection. And so our Ngurra project is the idea of a National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural precinct in the heart of the national capital, including a national resting place for our ancestral remains that have come home but can't immediately go back to country. It's a good idea. You all ought to get behind it. So these words give us alternative ways of thinking. So where do we go? Well, it will take some time, obviously. And we need that cognitive shift. Patrick Dodson said reconciliation must transcend Australian political theatre and promote a sense of national unity. Our theme is grounded in truth, walking together in courage. I think this transformation will take some courage to sustain in the long term. We need to start by thinking beyond just this year of Indigenous languages in relation to our conceptual armoury. We'll need to go beyond that. We will need to walk together with courage, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to ensure long-lasting and sustainable legacy. If we are to have the kind of reconciliation that works and that is transformative, we need to be courageous and engage in the process, even in the fear, in the face of our fear of making mistakes. This requires the kind of relationships that will sustain this kind of courage and engagement. And to conclude my remarks, I want to say in my own language, Nyanang Wungalu, let's all work together. Thank you.